not speaking about a city in the abstract sense, not a capital of concrete and glass, not an assembly of neighborhoods and ministries, but rather a multi-layered, elevation-locked, labyrinthine urban fortress, whose defensive geometry, demographic density, vertical complexity, and deliberate militarization turn it into one of the most impregnable urban environments in the Western Hemisphere, a place where any invading force, no matter how technologically advanced, no matter how well supplied, no matter how confident in its doctrine of rapid dominance, would find itself trapped inside a three-dimensional maze designed not to be conquered, but to consume whatever army is foolish enough to enter without total control of the surrounding mountains, control which, as I have already explained, the United States never had and never could obtain once the Ávila tunnels were destroyed. If the Ávila Range is the wall that protects Caracas and the city itself is the fortress behind the wall, a fortress not built of stone blocks and battlements, but of towering hillsides, dense favelas, narrow stair streets, vertical, high-rise kill zones, entrenched militias, overlapping alley networks, internal tunnel systems, rooftop vantage points, and a civilian population that knows every turn, every slope, every passageway, every line of sight. Caracas is not simply defended. Caracas is the defense. And as I examine the structure of this city, its terrain, its infrastructure, its social layout, and its strategic depth, it becomes painfully obvious why the United States could never have taken it, not even if the tunnels had remained intact, not even if the airport had stabilized, not even if maneuver space had existed, because Caracas is not a city to be captured. It is a city designed deliberately, relentlessly to break an invading force psychologically, tactically, and logistically. Let me begin with the most important fact. Caracas is a bowl. A deep, wide, steep bowl filled with millions of people, thousands of structures, and countless vantage points. The edges of the bowl rise sharply on all sides, forming a natural amphitheater from which defenders can observe, strike, ambush, and retreat at will. In urban warfare, elevation is everything. In Caracas, elevation is infinite. A force entering Caracas enters a kill bowl. A force trying to leave Caracas leaves through a kill bowl. There is no direction where the bowl does not dominate. And the deeper you go, the more trapped you become. This is not hyperbole. This is topography. And topography is destiny. Now consider the capital's density. Caracas is a city of narrow passages, constrained roads, sudden elevation changes, footpaths that twist between improvised structures and urban layers stacked vertically on top of each other. In many districts, there are no streets in the conventional sense, only stairs, ramps, corridors between walls, and improvised bridges. Mechanized units cannot operate here. Tanks cannot turn. Strikers cannot fit. JLTVs cannot maneuver. Even motorcycles struggle. Foot mobility is the only mobility, and foot mobility under fire is death. Imagine American infantry attempting to ascend a steep stair street covered by overlapping sniper nests, drone operators with direct line of sight, ATGM teams waiting behind blind corners, and militia groups who can retreat upward or downward through passageways unknown to outsiders. This is the kind of environment where a platoon can disappear around a corner and never be seen again, not because it was outgunned, but because it was outnavigated. Caracas is not a grid. Caracas is a vertical labyrinth, but the labyrinth is only half the problem. The other half, the more decisive half, is the population. Caracas is home to over 2 million people, and the terrain funnels entire communities into stacked layers of defensible terrain. These neighborhoods, particularly the densely packed favelas such as Pedere 23 de Janeiro and Katia, are effectively self-contained micro-fortresses. The pathways are so tight, so twisted, so uncertain that even the most advanced mapping software cannot accurately model them. And these communities, familiar with every elevation change, every rooftop, every escape path, become an extension of the city's defensive structure. In urban combat, local knowledge is worth more than armor. In Caracas, local knowledge is omnipresent. If an American unit were forced into these zones, it would face ambushes from above and below simultaneously. IED traps built into stairways, drones dropping grenades into alleys only 2 meters wide, snipers with 200 overlapping firing angles, crowds masking militia movement, decoys on rooftops, false retreat corridors leading into kill boxes, improvised tunnels beneath streets, rooftop to rooftop jumps inaccessible to foreign troops, and communication interference created by dense concrete walls and EW saturation. A foreign army cannot dominate an environment. It cannot interpret. Caracas is uninterpretable by outsiders. But perhaps the most devastating feature of Caracas, and the element that transforms it from a challenging urban environment into an absolute nightmare for an invading force, is verticality combined with social density. This city is not simply built on hills, it is carved into them. Homes cling to slopes at angles that defy urban planning. Towers rise above ravines. Ridges cut across districts like anatomical walls. Every rooftop becomes a sniper position. Every balcony becomes a firing slit. Every window becomes an overwatch station. Every stairwell becomes an ambush corridor. And all of it, every inch of it, is oriented downward. The attacker is always climbing. The defender is always descending. There is no street in Caracas that favors the attacker. There are hundreds that annihilate him. Even in the modern districts, Plaza, Venezuela, Chacao, Altamira, the density of high-rises creates urban canyons where echoes distort sound, vertical angles distort fire, reflective surfaces distort optics, and defenders can attack from 20 stories above or 6 levels of underground parking below. Caracas fights in all directions. Caracas fights in all dimensions. And Caracas has spent 20 years preparing for this fight. Throughout the city, thousands of militia fighters, colectivos, Bolivarian community groups, irregulars, reservists, and state-aligned neighborhood defense networks have been trained specifically for block by block, rooftop to rooftop, stair to stair combat. Many of these fighters have rehearsed ambush patterns, established caches, mapped blind spots, and prepared fallback positions long before the United States even contemplated an operation. These are not soldiers in the Western sense. They are terrain specialists, men who know how to navigate a city the same way a mountain tribe navigates cliffs. They do not need armored vehicles. They do not need heavy weaponry. They need only the city, and the city does the killing for them. But the most devastating truth, the one that ensures Caracas can never be taken, is that this city, unlike cities in Iraq or Afghanistan where structures could be isolated, cordoned, and breached one by one, cannot be isolated. You cannot island a Caracas neighborhood because every district is connected vertically. Remove one path, another appears below. Block one alley, defenders emerge above. Collapse one building, they retreat sideways through improvised passageways. Caracas is not simply built on terrain. Caracas is terrain. And when terrain is alive, connected, vertical, and populated, it becomes invincible to any force that cannot dominate all heights simultaneously. The United States cannot dominate all heights simultaneously. Not without taking Ávila, not without maneuver space, not without logistics that exceed reality, not without air power able to withstand endless drone saturation, not without thousands of casualties, not without political collapse at home. And so the fundamental truth is this. Even if American forces had reached the city's edge, they would have died in the streets within days. Caracas is not a battlefield. Caracas is a meat grinder waiting to be activated. Even before the first shot is fired inside the city proper, the strategic calculus already predicts catastrophe. Why? Because in Caracas, the defender has infinite firing positions. The attacker has none. The defender has infinite concealment. The attacker has none. The defender has infinite mobility through paths the attacker cannot use. The attacker moves only through predictable corridors. The defender blends into the population. The attacker stands out in every way: height, gear, language, movement pattern. The defender has home field knowledge. The attacker walks blind. The defender controls the heights. The attacker climbs into fire. The defender can disappear. The attacker cannot. This asymmetry is so extreme that urban warfare modeling conducted by European and South American analysts concluded that American casualties in the first 72 hours of a penetration attempt could reach levels not seen since Hue in 1968. But unlike Hue, Caracas is 10 times the size, 4 times the population density, and infinitely more complex in topography. Hue was flat. Caracas is vertical. Hue was gridded. Caracas is chaotic. Hue had open avenues for armor. Caracas traps armor in alleys narrower than a pickup truck. Hue had predictable building layouts. Caracas has improvised structures stacked like geological layers. Hue was a tactical battle. Caracas would be a strategic slaughter. And this is why the Venezuelan defenders do not fear an American penetration. They expect it, they train for it, they welcome it, because inside Caracas, the Americans are not the hunters. Inside Caracas, the Americans are the prey. This is a reality no one in Washington wanted to face. This is a reality no one briefed the American public about. This is the reality the terrain architects of the city understood long before American planners ever opened digital maps of the region. Caracas is designed to devour invaders. And by the time any American force would have approached its outer edges, the city, fully mobilized, fully awake, fully aware, would have turned itself into a fortress so deep, so layered, so vertical, and so ahead of the attacker in environmental mastery that the only rational decision left would be to avoid entering altogether. And avoiding it means the operation fails. And entering it means the operation dies. That is the paradox of Caracas. And that is why this city, more than any other place in Venezuela, guarantees that no foreign force can conquer this country by military means. And the more deeply one examines the defensive architecture of Caracas, the more brutally apparent it becomes that the city was not merely built to withstand pressure, but engineered through both geography and social structure to absorb, redirect, distort, and ultimately destroy any attacking force foolish enough to enter without overwhelming control of the heights, the logistics chain, the electromagnetic spectrum, the drone arena, and the population itself. Because Caracas is not just a city in a valley. It is a living network of urban arteries and elevated sanctuaries that extend upward into the slopes, downward into sub-basements, sideways through improvised tunnels, and outward through narrow concrete channels that only the defender understands, which means an invader is not simply fighting enemy fighters. He is fighting the city itself, a city that has merged with its defenders to form a single, indivisible organism designed to break the invading body one limb at a time. If you want to understand why no American force could have taken Caracas even under ideal conditions, you must understand the concept of urban dominance through vertical labyrinths. Unlike the predictable patterns of Middle Eastern cities or the wide boulevards of European capitals, Caracas presents a multi-angled threat grid where every elevation change multiplies danger. Every footstep echoes unpredictably, and every attempt to straighten the battlefield collapses under the chaotic geometry of structures stacked atop other structures, without blueprint, without plan, without symmetry, but with enormous defensive potential. The favelas alone constitute an entirely new dimension of warfare. These are not slum districts in the way outsiders imagine them. They are vertical micro-territories, hundreds of densely packed dwellings, clinging to slopes connected by stairways, so narrow that only one person can pass at a time, roofs so close that defenders can leap from one to another, alleys so tight that drones can skim the walls without being tracked in interior routes, so convoluted that a foreign soldier could spend half a day navigating 30 meters of terrain. Inside such an environment, superior weapons do not matter. Night vision does not matter. Armor does not matter. Training does not matter. What matters is familiarity, and the defenders have it completely while the attackers have none. But even beyond the favelas, the high-rise districts form another layer of the fortress. Tower blocks, socialist-era residential slabs, commercial complexes, and vertical clusters form urban canyons deeper than anything in Fallujah or Mosul. A sniper on the 17th floor can kill an entire squad without ever exposing himself. A drone operator operating from a 23rd floor balcony can target intersections the Americans do not even know exist. A militia unit moving through underground parking structures can outflank an entire infantry company without ever appearing on overhead surveillance. Verticality is not a feature of Caracas. It is its weapon. And yet, the true genius of Caracas as a fortress lies not only in the environment itself, but in how seamlessly defenders can flow between environments A militia unit in Katia can move downslope through a series of stairwells, and improvised paths emerge onto a major traffic artery, continue through drainage tunnels beneath the freeway, and reappear halfway across the city in less than an hour, all without being detected by foreign forces who cannot even map the route. This is what makes Caracas unbeatable in urban warfare. The defenders can move in ways the attackers cannot even imagine, and the attackers can move only in ways the defenders already control. At the core of this dynamic is a relationship between time and mobility. Defenders can halt movement indefinitely. Attackers must move constantly. But in Caracas, movement itself is a death sentence. Every step upward becomes a kill zone. Every corner becomes a choke point. Every open surface becomes a sniper gallery. Every rooftop becomes a drone nest. Every shadow becomes a firing position. This is why urban warfare doctrine warns repeatedly that cities built into mountains are nearly impossible to take because the mountain itself acts as a multiplier for the urban defenders. In dense terrain, defenders are already difficult to find. In elevated, dense terrain, they become ghosts. Let me be explicit here. Caracas is optimized for asymmetric warfare in ways no American war planner properly accounted for. Take the example of Petare, one of the largest slums in Latin America. Its structure is so steep, so irregular, so claustrophobic that even Venezuelan regular army units avoid entering without local militia support. Now imagine sending American infantry unfamiliar with the terrain to clear it block by block. They would not even reach the second ridge before taking unsustainable casualties. Drones cannot see into the interior corridors. Thermal optics break against concrete density. GPS navigation fails entirely. Radio signals bounce unpredictably. Every footstep becomes the prelude to an ambush. Now multiply Petare by 20. That is Caracas. But this is only the physical dimension. The psychological dimension is even more devastating. In urban warfare, uncertainty kills. Soldiers can endure combat when they know where the enemy is. In Caracas, the enemy is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. You hear footsteps above you but cannot reach them. You hear whispering through walls but cannot locate the source. You hear drones but cannot see them. You hear gunshots but cannot determine the angle. You see laser reflections but cannot find the shooter. This kind of psychological pressure destroys the morale of even elite units. American troops acclimated to wide fields of view, clear sectors, defined corridors, and predictable threat arcs would enter Caracas blind. Their training would help them shoot. It would not help them understand where to shoot. The difference is fatal. Next, we must examine how Caracas functions as a population shield. With more than 2 million civilians clustered across valley folds, stair districts, and tower clusters, the defender becomes indistinguishable from the civilian base. This is not human shielding in the simplistic sense. This is population density advantage. Even if the Americans attempted precision strikes, they would hit concrete nests that house both a sniper and 7 civilians. Destroying the sniper kills the civilians. Avoiding civilian casualties means leaving the sniper untouched. Either option is a loss. Urban density eliminates clean decisions. Meanwhile, the defenders exploit this density masterfully. They move through crowds wearing civilian clothes, hide weapons and furniture, use rooftops as staging points, move through schools and clinics, use courtyards as mortar firing positions. They fight as an extension of their environment. For the attacker, this creates the single most dangerous condition in warfare. You cannot distinguish threat from non-threat. In such circumstances, your rules of engagement fracture, your judgment fractures, your discipline fractures, your cohesion fractures, your confidence fractures. Caracas is built to break all 5. Now consider what must occur for an invading force to actually capture Caracas. You would need to control every major elevation, neutralize thousands of militia and irregular fighters, dominate airspace that is obstructed by vertical concrete, map a labyrinth in real time under fire, coordinate infantry movements through hundreds of blind intersections, remove or isolate 2 million civilians, manage humanitarian crises, sustain 360-degree defense in a city that offers no safe rear areas, defeat underground networks. You cannot detect and supply tens of thousands of troops through narrow, congested, drone-saturated routes. No army in history has ever accomplished something equivalent. Not the Russians in Grozny, not the Americans in Fallujah, not the Israelis in Gaza, not the Germans in Stalingrad, not the coalition in Mosul. Caracas is all of these environments multiplied by elevation and density. And elevation changes everything. A sniper placed on a hill overlooking Altamira can hit American positions across half the city. A mortar team located on the side of La Pastora can strike Plaza Venezuela. A drone team atop a tower in Chacao can drop munitions on 10 different avenues without changing positions. A single militia group in San Agustin can control 3 separate access routes using nothing but line-of-sight elevation. You cannot seize a city whose heights you do not control. And you cannot control the heights of Caracas without controlling Ávila. And you cannot control Ávila without the tunnels. And the tunnels are gone. This is the strategic domino effect Washington never comprehended. Caracas is shielded by Ávila. The airport is trapped by Ávila. The tunnels are the key to Ávila. The tunnels are destroyed by the defender. Therefore, Caracas is untouchable. This is not a matter of bravery or equipment. It is a matter of logic. Now let me address what happens if, against all common sense, American forces manage to push into the outer districts through sheer sacrifice and force of will. They enter the valley of no return. Urban warfare doctrine states that once an invading force penetrates deep enough into a city without securing reliable supply and extraction routes, it becomes more vulnerable than in any open fight. It becomes a trapped animal in the hunter's den, surrounded by claws coming from the walls, the floors, the ceilings, the alleys, the roofs. Caracas amplifies this vulnerability to its maximum extreme. Once American forces enter the city, their formation disintegrates. Platoons cannot stay together. Companies cannot coordinate. Vehicles cannot advance or retreat. Air support cannot see clearly. UAVs cannot track. Medics cannot move casualties. Engineers cannot clear obstacles. Communications cannot propagate. Supply cannot reach forward elements. Command cannot maintain real-time situational awareness. The Americans would fight in fragments. And fragments are easy to kill. At this point, American casualties would skyrocket. The Venezuelans would not need heavy weaponry. They would use rooftops, drop grenades, deploy snipers, launch drones, use alley angles, employ simple RPGs in stair corners, and disappear up slopes the Americans cannot climb. You could lose an entire battalion in a single afternoon without ever encountering a front line. This is why Caracas is more than a city. Caracas is a trap layered like sediment, each layer more deadly than the last. The first layer is the favelas. The second is the high-rise zones. The third is the elevated ridge districts. The fourth is the transitional slopes. The fifth is the tunnels beneath the city. The sixth is the psychological pressure of defending your home. The seventh is the impossibility of foreign navigation. The eighth is the drone saturation. The ninth is population density. The 10th is the elevation bowl. To take Caracas, you must defeat all 10 layers. No foreign force ever will. And this is the truth that ultimately breaks whatever remains of the American invasion plan. Caracas is not an objective you capture. It is an objective that destroys you for attempting to. By the time any American commander contemplates entering the city, the conclusion is already predetermined. He cannot win. He cannot stabilize. He cannot clear. He cannot hold. He cannot rotate forces. He cannot sustain tempo. He cannot retreat without catastrophe. He cannot advance without annihilation. He stands before a fortress built of millions of lives and thousands of vertical layers, knowing that every step into the city is a step into a chamber designed to grind armies to ash. Every modern army has limits. Caracas exceeds all of them. When you fully internalize the structure, psychology, and geometry of Caracas as a battle space, you begin to understand that any foreign army pushing into this city is not engaging in an urban fight in the classic sense, but walking into a multi-layered self-reinforcing system of traps, engineered by terrain, architecture, elevation, and human adaptation, a system that does not merely resist invasion, but actively restructures itself in real time to consume the invading force through an endless sequence of ambushes, blind corridors, kill funnels, vertical assaults, attritional engagements designed to sever the attacker's cohesion, exhaust his logistics, overwhelm his command system, and break his will long before he reaches the central districts, because Caracas does not fight like a city at all. It fights like a living mountain. To truly grasp this, you must imagine what happens when an American mechanized or infantry formation, already weakened and exhausted from the battles beneath Ávila and the collapse of mobility at Maiquetía, attempts to force its way into a city that funnels attackers into upward sloping avenues, which terminate in killbox intersections controlled from 3, sometimes 4 vertical angles. Every avenue in Caracas, no matter how wide it appears on satellite imagery, becomes a death channel once you are inside it. A single intersection can host stable lock because the geometry of the city creates dead zones, blind spots, and signal reflections. Caracas steals the sky from the attacker. This is why American air power, so dominant in open terrain, becomes almost irrelevant inside the bowl. Tactical air cannot see. Strategic air cannot distinguish. Attack helicopters cannot linger. Recon drones cannot map. Even the most advanced targeting pods cannot process the cross-layered optical noise created by concrete, glass, steel, moisture, and elevation. The attacker becomes blind. The defender sees everything. And once you lose the sky, urban warfare is a one-sided slaughter. Let me illustrate this further. Imagine a U.S. infantry company pushing up Avenida Sucre toward Katia. The road looks wide, but within 30 seconds of entering, they are hit simultaneously by fire from above, fire from below, drone is descending, drones waiting at mid-level windows, gunfire from alleys. So narrow light barely enters, and militants emerging from staircases disguised behind market stalls. The company cannot push forward because the slope steepens and narrows. They cannot retreat because barricades have been erected behind them. They cannot climb to the flanking rooftops because access is controlled by residents. They cannot call in air support because every request is stable lock, because the geometry of the city creates dead zones, blind spots, and signal reflections. Caracas steals the sky from the attacker. This is why American air power, so dominant in open terrain, becomes almost irrelevant inside the bowl. Tactical air cannot see. Strategic air cannot distinguish. Attack helicopters cannot linger. Recon drones cannot map. Even the most advanced targeting pods cannot process the cross-layered optical noise created by concrete, glass, steel, moisture, and elevation. The attacker becomes blind. The defender sees everything. And once you lose the sky, urban warfare is a one-sided slaughter. Let me illustrate this further. Imagine a U.S. infantry company pushing up Avenida Sucre toward Katia. The road looks wide, but within 30 seconds of entering, they are hit simultaneously by fire from above, fire from below, drone is descending, drones waiting at mid-level windows, gunfire from alleys. So narrow light barely enters, and militants emerging from staircases disguised behind market stalls. The company cannot push forward because the slope steepens and narrows. They cannot retreat because barricades have been erected behind them. They cannot climb to the flanking rooftops because access is controlled by residents. They cannot call in air support because every request is either jammed or too risky. They cannot call armor forward because the road is too constricted. They cannot suppress the snipers across 300 different firing positions. They cannot advance because every movement is observed. They cannot hide because they are foreigners in open view. This is not a battle. This is annihilation at walking pace. Now shift your perspective to the defenders. They move through rooftops, down stair tunnels, across balcony bridges, through interior courtyards, down ravines, up slopes, and into improvised underground passages. Their mobility is omnidirectional. American mobility is one-directional. This is what makes the city unbeatable. In Fallujah, the U.S. Marines could flatten a block, move through it, secure it, and then expand. In Mosul, the coalition could use heavy armor and airstrikes to create corridors. In Gaza, Israel can isolate neighborhoods and cut supply lines. In Baghdad, the U.S. could bypass hostile roads with helicopters and strikers. None of that is possible in Caracas. If you flatten a block, you reveal 3 more layers of defensible elevation behind it. If you attempt to create corridors, the city funnels you upward toward higher slopes. If you attempt to isolate neighborhoods, defenders simply shift through vertical passageways. And there is another factor that cannot be underestimated. Caracas has been preparing for this scenario for decades. Militia networks, colectivos, reservists, and urban guerrilla cells have pre-planned fallback positions, rooftop supply caches, firing routes, sniper galleries, drone stations, tunnel nodes, emergency medical points, choke point ambushes, interior withdrawal corridors, disguised strong points, and dozens of improvised weapons factories scattered across the city. These fighters are not uniformed soldiers with strict chains of command. They are distributed, autonomous, highly adaptable micro units embedded within the civilian fabric. They know every staircase, every shortcut, every hidden ladder, every rooftop gap, every blind corner, every sewer connection, every bus station, underpass. You cannot root out an enemy who is the city. Meanwhile, American troops cannot adapt fast enough. The equipment they rely on becomes deadweight. Night vision cannot navigate the labyrinths. Body armor becomes a burden. Radios become unreliable. Heavy packs, slow movement. Precision weapons cannot find targets. Engineers cannot breach walls fast enough. JTACs cannot coordinate airstrikes in a vertical maze. Everything the Americans do makes them more vulnerable. And then we must confront the nightmare scenario. Caracas fights continuously without a front line. In traditional warfare, you advance through zones. In Caracas, there are no zones. Every block is a front line. Every building is a defensive position. Every alley is an ambush site. Every home is a fortress. Every rooftop is a battlefield. This is where logistics collapse entirely. To supply a single company inside Caracas, you would need secure routes, armored convoys, airlift resupply, open landing zones, reliable communication, casualty evacuation corridors, medical staging areas, and engineering support. Caracas offers none of these. Instead, supply convoys become targets. A single RPG fired from a stairwell can destroy a fuel truck. A drone can detonate a grenade atop an ammunition carrier. A sniper can kill the lead driver and stall the entire convoy. A barricade erected within minutes can block retreat. Resupply becomes suicide. Medevac becomes impossible. Command becomes blind. Coordination collapses. Morale disintegrates. And the Americans still have not reached the city center. Then comes the most brutal element of all. Caracas never stops escalating. If you take one street, 3 more are already prepared. If you clear one ridge, 2 more wait behind it. If you silence one sniper, 5 more replace him. If you destroy one drone nest, 10 more activate. If you capture one strong point, the defenders melt upward into the next layer. This is what makes Caracas unwinnable. You do not advance into the city. The city advances into you. Your casualties rise. Your supply lines thin. Your command structure wavers. Your troops become exhausted. Your equipment breaks. Your discipline fractures. Your objectives fade into impossibility. And all the while, the defenders remain energized by the single most powerful force in urban warfare, home field conviction. They are not fighting for a hill. They are not fighting for a checkpoint. They are fighting for their homes, their families, their streets, their identity. An invading force cannot match that. No amount of training, technology, precision, or firepower can equal the advantage of defending the place where you were born, where you live, where every window is familiar. And when the Americans look around and realize that every window contains a rifle barrel, every rooftop contains a drone, every alley contains a trap, and every building contains an enemy who cannot be distinguished from a civilian, their will to fight collapses far faster than their bodies do. This is the mastery of Caracas. And if you think the U.S. could bypass the favelas by pushing through modern districts like Chacao, Altamira, or La Castellana, you misunderstand the city entirely. These areas, though wealthier, are equally lethal because their high-rise density creates vertical kill towers where defenders can engage from angles U, S, Forces cannot even detect angles that do not exist in American training simulations or operational experience. Urban warfare becomes three-dimensional chess. The Americans bring checkers pieces. Now imagine trying to coordinate a battalion advance. You cannot. Companies dissolve into platoons. Platoons dissolve into squads. Squads dissolve into isolated fire teams. Fire teams dissolve into individuals fighting for survival. This is not a battle you win. This is a battle you escape from. And once a force reaches escape psychology, the operation is over. Caracas does not need to kill an invading army. It needs only to convince the invading army that staying is suicide. Once that happens, the war is finished. And this is the conclusion any honest American commander would reach within the first 72 hours of penetrating the urban rim. We cannot take this city. Even if we reach the center, we will not leave it alive. This recognition, quiet, buried behind political messaging, hidden from public view, would spread through the officers, then through the NCOs, then through the troops themselves. Fear grows. Uncertainty grows. Chaos spreads. Orders lose clarity. Units lose cohesion. The mission loses meaning. And the retreat, whether planned or forced, becomes inevitable. Caracas does not need to fight you. Caracas needs only to absorb you. And once absorbed, you do not reemerge. You dissolve into the city like rain into soil. That is the nature of this fortress. And that is why no foreign military, including ours, can ever hope to conquer it. And when you fully confront the consequences of an invading force being absorbed into Caracas, this vertical labyrinth of concrete, steel ravines, stair streets, dead angles, elevation traps, drone funnels, rooftop firing arcs, and population-saturated micro-territories, you begin to understand that the collapse of an operation inside such a city does not occur suddenly with one decisive ambush or one catastrophic defeat, but rather through a creeping disintegration of tactical cohesion, logistical reach, command clarity, troop confidence, and operational meaning. Because once the attacker loses the ability to dictate even a single dimension of the battle, the attacker becomes a passenger inside his own campaign, reacting to events that shape themselves faster than he can process them. And Caracas, more than any modern city I have studied, accelerates this process with an unforgiving intensity that strips the invading force of every advantage it thought it possessed. The most devastating moment does not come when the Americans take casualties. It comes when they realize that casualties no longer matter, because casualties are no longer the main mechanism of defeat. Defeat arrives through invisibility, through exhaustion, through psychological compression, through fragmentation of the operational picture, through overwhelming sensory overload, and through the collapse of meaning itself when the troops understand that they are pushing into a city that cannot be captured, cannot be controlled, cannot be stabilized, and cannot be understood. At this point, the American formations begin to deteriorate from cohesive units into isolated survival elements. Platoons that once advanced with confidence now cling to cover-hugging stair walls and vehicle husks, because they understand that moving 30 feet forward in Caracas is equivalent to moving into the center of a firing circle where the angles are infinite and the attacker is always below the defender. You must imagine the reality of fighting in a city where gravity itself is your enemy, where every building above you becomes a potential firing point, where every roof contains silhouettes you cannot identify, where every balcony conceals a drone operator, where every stairwell funnels you upward toward an enemy who has the drop on you, and where the streets offer no lateral escape because all paths narrow, bend, rise, and choke as they approach the interior districts. This is why Caracas is so lethal. It offers no straight lines, no clean approaches, no areas of depopulated maneuver, no room for armor, no meaningful air corridors, no opportunities for precision strikes, no ability to isolate sub-districts, and no safe zones for medical stabilization or casualty evacuation. Everything you do in Caracas is a form of exposure. The defenders, by contrast, experience none of this exposure. They are submerged inside the terrain. They are invisible until the moment they strike. They appear, fire, withdraw, ascend, merge into the human landscape, and reemerge somewhere else entirely. And because Caracas is carved into overlapping elevation layers, defenders can retreat uphill into favelas like 23 de Enero or Petrolero, vanish into rooftop networks in Katia, disappear into the commercial folds of Sabana Grande, slip through underground transit tunnels near Capitolio, or shift across ravine bridges in San Agustin. The Americans cannot follow without exposing themselves on multiple axes. This is what I mean when I say Caracas is designed to consume invaders. Its internal flow favors the defender absolutely. Its external approach favors the defender absolutely. Its elevation matrix favors the defender absolutely. Its social terrain favors the defender absolutely. Its visibility matrix favors the defender absolutely. Its drone angles favor the defender absolutely. There is no breakout path for an attacking force, only deeper levels of entrapment. And now we reach the point where logistics collapse entirely because a city like Caracas is not only impossible to capture, it is impossible to sustain an invasion inside it. When American forces begin taking casualties, the process of extraction becomes a crisis. Medics cannot move stretcher teams through stair channels under fire. Supply lines cannot ascend, steep roads clogged with debris, barricades, and destroyed vehicles. Drones target medevac routes. Snipers hit the rear elements first, cutting off retreat. Mortar teams fire from elevated ravines that no surveillance system can penetrate. Every supply route becomes a death route. Every casualty evacuation becomes a gamble. Every forward push becomes a point of no return. Troops begin to carry wounded with improvised drag systems because stretchers cannot fit through alleyways. Pilots hover over rooftops but cannot land because every rooftop is a trap. Engineers who try to clear rubble are shot from above. Communications break down because concrete layers distort transmissions, and EW teams in the hills amplify the chaos. A unit attempting to move 20 blocks loses the ability to receive radio orders. A medic attempting to establish a casualty collection point finds himself surrounded. A platoon entering a favela loses GPS within 30 seconds. A company advancing up a ridge road loses half its vehicles to drones before reaching the first bend. Caracas does not kill the invader with battles. It kills him with impossibility. And impossibility is the most lethal form of warfare because it destroys not only bodies but belief. Once belief collapses, cohesion collapses. Once cohesion collapses, the army collapses. And once the army collapses, the campaign collapses. This is the downward spiral metastasizing inside every American formation attempting to penetrate the rim of the city. But the most terrifying part comes next. Because Caracas is so vast, so layered, so dense, and so vertically fragmented that once American units pass a certain depth inside the bowl, they cannot get out. Retreat becomes more dangerous than advance. Every path behind them is now controlled by rooftop teams waiting for withdrawal. Every stairwell becomes a reverse ambush. Every intersection becomes a choke point where snipers anticipate retreat patterns. Every drone operator switches from harassment mode to pursuit mode. The city closes behind them as tightly as it closes in front. This is the moment where operational logic breaks entirely. American commanders who still cling to the illusion of control suddenly realize that they have no map, no intelligence picture, no stabilized supply routes, no air superiority, no urban control, no ability to consolidate ground, and no ability to rotate exhausted units out of the kill zones. You cannot rotate units out of Caracas. You rotate them into Caracas, and they simply do not come back. This is the nightmare the Pentagon never accounted for. One day you wake up and discover that an entire battalion is now a ghost force present on the roster, absent in reality, dissolved inside a city that swallows movement faster than you can record it. Meanwhile, the defenders grow stronger with every passing hour. They recruit from the population. They gather intelligence from civilians. They receive supplies through networks the Americans cannot see. They use motorcycles on slopes the Americans cannot climb. They operate drones from rooftops the Americans cannot reach. They set up ambush points and structures the Americans cannot enter. They retreat through tunnels the Americans do not know exist. The invader becomes weaker over time. The defender becomes stronger over time. This is the death equation that Caracas imposes. And once the Americans finally admit internally, even if they refuse to say it aloud, that pushing deeper is suicide, they attempt the only remaining option: pull back. But pulling back is infinitely harder than pushing forward, because withdrawal exposes their flanks to angles they cannot suppress, reveals their routes to drones overhead, and gives the defenders complete predictability over their movement. The Americans enter the most dangerous phase of all reverse attrition. When they advance, the city kills them. When they retreat, the city kills them faster. Retreating from a vertical city is like trying to descend a cliff while 1,000 shooters fire at you from above. Gravity becomes the enemy. Every step downward is exposed. Every rooftop becomes a firing platform. Every alley becomes a bottleneck. Every vehicle becomes a target. Every drone becomes a guided bullet. And the U.S. force, already exhausted by weeks of stagnation at the airport, cannot execute a coordinated withdrawal through a city designed specifically to prevent such coordination. Units lose contact. They split. They panic. They make noise. They cluster. They break discipline. They retreat without cover because their cover is now controlled by the very enemy they face. This is when casualties spike exponentially. This is when entire platoons disappear. This is when officers die trying to maintain order. This is when medics run out of supplies. This is when ammunition becomes priceless. This is when commanders finally stop pretending the operation can be salvaged. And this is when the politicians in Washington, thousands of miles away, begin to grasp that the operation they authorized, the operation they sold to the public, the operation they believed would be swift and decisive, has devolved into a slow-motion catastrophe with no exit that preserves dignity, no route that preserves force structure, and no path that preserves credibility. But Caracas is not done. Caracas punishes denial. As American forces struggle to retreat to the outskirts, the defenders elevate their pressure. They strike supply vehicles first. They target radios. They disable night vision gear with concentrated laser beams from rooftops. They block secondary escape routes with burning debris. They drop makeshift explosives onto retreating platoons from elevated balconies. They launch drones at convoys packed too tightly to evade. They strike medical vehicles intentionally, not out of cruelty, but because medevac disruption causes structural collapse faster than small arms fire ever could. This is how you break an expeditionary force. You attack not the soldiers, but the conditions that allow soldiers to function. Finally, the remnants of American units reach the edge of the bowl, not because they won, but because they survived long enough to escape the gravitational pull of the city. But even outside the city, they cannot rest. They must now retreat back toward Maiquetía under non-stop pressure from Venezuelan units, who understand that the Americans are no longer a fighting force, but a retreating mass. And when they reach the airport, what awaits them is not salvation, but the final phase of collapse. The runway is damaged. The aircraft are degraded. The fuel is low. The perimeter is thin. The troops are broken. The helicopters are overstressed. The mountain is watching. And the city behind them, that monstrous fortress, has done its work. Caracas did not repel the Americans. Caracas dismantled them. Caracas removed their cohesion. Caracas stole their confidence. Caracas shattered their logistics. Caracas dissolved their formations. Caracas turned their advance into a retreat and their retreat into a collapse. No enemy army could accomplish that. Only the city could. And that is why Caracas is not a battlefield. It is the guarantee of strategic defeat for any invader who attempts to take it. And as the remnants of the American force withdraw from the collapsing maze of Caracas, battered, fragmented, exhausted, and psychologically hollowed out in a way no casualty statistic can properly capture, you finally see with a harsh clarity that strips away every illusion on which the operation was built, that the defeat did not occur in the firefights, nor in the drone strikes, nor in the ambushes, nor in the shattered stairwells, nor in the smoldering corridors of the favelas, but in the very assumption that a foreign military could enter a city as impenetrable, as unyielding, as complex, and as elevation dominant as Caracas, and still emerge intact, because Caracas is not merely defended, it is engineered by geography, history, density, and human adaptation to crush invaders long before they understand they have entered a battle space that cannot be shaped, cannot be controlled, and cannot be conquered. The final phase of collapse reveals itself the moment the the command begins planning evacuation from the airport once again, not from a position of strength, not from a position of regained momentum, but from a position of unavoidable necessity, because the moment you attempt to exit a fortress, should never have entered the fortress, uses your withdrawal as its last and most devastating weapon. The Americans come down from the bowl in fragments carrying wounded, whose eyes stare blankly, not from trauma alone, but from the realization that everything they endured was for terrain that cannot be held and objectives that cannot be achieved. As they regroup at the outer rim, the defenders press just enough pressure, not enough to cause annihilation, but enough to accelerate the collapse of American order, enough to ensure that no unit can catch its breath, enough to transform retreat into flight. When the first American elements approach the outskirts, the city does not pursue them with heavy assaults. It does not need to. It uses gravity angles and psychological momentum. Snipers fire sporadically from behind. Drones harass stragglers. Mortars walk the ground at intervals that feel perfectly timed to prevent rest. Units that pause too long are hit. Units that move too fast become separated. Units that try to regroup lose time. Units that try to treat casualties become targets again. This is not a chase. This is a controlled bleed out. The defenders who never needed to commit large formations to begin with now commit even fewer because the Americans are no longer a fighting force. They are retreating mass fatigued beyond the limits of discipline, stripped of clarity, and burdened by wounded whose evacuation slows every step. When the last American platoons finally reach the flattened outskirts between the bowl and the airport corridor, they find a staging area barely capable of supporting survival. The road is cratered. Vehicles are damaged. Casualties outnumber medics. Supplies are scattered. Communications are intermittent. Helicopters cannot land because the defenders have repositioned laser dazzlers and manpads teams on every ridge with direct line of sight to the corridor. Evacuation must occur in a staggered pattern that increases vulnerability exponentially. Meanwhile, the psychological shock sets in. They have not lost a battle. They have lost the city itself, a city they never truly entered, a city that refused to be conquered, a city that stripped them of their momentum and revealed their vulnerability. When the Americans attempt to reorganize at the airport, they discover that the base is now worse than when they left it. The perimeter is even thinner. The fuel state is critical. The runway requires repairs that cannot be done under fire. The helicopters that remain operational are at the edge of mechanical tolerance. Generators are burning out. Water supplies are contaminated. Electronic warfare has intensified. The airport is not a sanctuary. It is the final circle of the trap. And now the defenders fully understand what is happening. The Americans are preparing to leave. Withdrawal is no longer speculation. It is visible, it is measurable, it is predictable. And predictability is fatal under elevation dominance. As the U.S. forces begin destroying sensitive equipment, burning documents, smashing systems, and preparing aircraft for exfiltration, the Venezuelan defenders increase pressure with mathematical precision. They do not need to aim for mass casualties. They aim for timing disruption. Disrupt the flight schedule. Disrupt the refueling. Disrupt the perimeter handover. Disrupt the cargo loading. Disrupt the medevac priority list. Disrupt the radio coordination. Disrupt the evacuation sequencing. Anything that delays departure increases casualties. Anything that increases casualties deepens chaos. Anything that deepens chaos collapses command. A single mortar round that lands near a helicopter delays its takeoff by 20 minutes. A single drone diving into a rotor disc halts evacuation across an entire sector. A single sniper round hitting a crew chief breaks a launch cycle. A single EW pulse disables communications between two elements, coordinating withdrawal. The Venezuelans use these micro-attacks with surgical precision, death by delay. And the Americans, watching their exit narrowing by the second, understand that the entire campaign now hinges on getting out alive. This is the moment when the last illusions die. They know they cannot win. They know they cannot hold. They know they cannot return. They know they cannot justify the cost. They know the operation is over. But they still must leave, and leaving is far more dangerous than staying. As aircraft begin lifting off, they must climb through a vertical gauntlet where the mountain slopes create a natural firing gallery. Manpads streak upward. Drones ascend in swarms. Snipers fire at cockpit glass. Mortars bracket the tarmac. Every helicopter that tilts into ascent must do so under a storm of fire. This is the final humiliation. A force that arrived from the sky is now fleeing from the sky. The defenders do not need to shoot down every aircraft. They need only to threaten enough of them to create panic. And they succeed. One helicopter takes a hit and crash lands on the far side of the runway. Another loses altitude under drone attack. Another aborts climb and slams into a berm. Another refuses to power up after EW pulses lock its sensors. Another lifts off but is forced to dump cargo mid-flight to reduce weight. Everything becomes desperation. The last American units on the ground, the ones responsible for holding the perimeter, while the rest evacuate, bear the worst burden. They must defend an airfield that is falling apart around them under fire from above, with no guarantee that the last aircraft will even have space to lift. These soldiers fight not for victory, not for progress, not for strategy, but simply to buy seconds. Seconds that helicopters need to ascend, seconds that crews need to load casualties, seconds that mechanics need to restart engines, seconds that commanders need to issue final orders. War is often decided in minutes. This evacuation is decided in seconds. Finally, the last helicopter lifts off, not majestically, not confidently, but at a shuddering angle, rising through smoke, dodging tracer fire, pushing against turbulent downdrafts from the mountain, and carrying on board the final remnants of an operation that had collapsed not from lack of courage, but from lack of understanding of the terrain, lack of understanding of the city, lack of understanding of the population, lack of understanding of elevation, lack of understanding of urban asymmetry, lack of understanding of geography itself. When the final aircraft breaks away from the basin and the airport shrinks behind them, every surviving American on board knows that they were not defeated by an army in the traditional sense. They were defeated by a city that weaponized its own structure, its own people, its own mountain walls, its own geometry. Caracas did not need tanks. Caracas did not need jets. Caracas did not need battalions. Caracas needed only to exist exactly as it is. And therein lies the strategic revelation. Caracas is unconquerable not because its defenders are superhuman, but because its terrain makes them unbeatable inside its boundaries. This is the lesson the Pentagon refused to learn. They believed urban warfare was a matter of precision and overwhelming firepower. Caracas teaches that urban warfare is a matter of elevation and entanglement. They believed a city could be mapped and modeled. Caracas teaches that a city can live and adapt. They believe the attacker dictates urban tempo. Caracas teaches that the defender dictates everything. They believed air power could solve complexity. Caracas teaches that vertical terrain cancels air power. They believe morale could be sustained through discipline. Caracas teaches that morale collapses when meaning collapses. They believe the United States could take a capital quickly. Caracas teaches that some capitals are immune to conquest. And above all, they believe strategy could bend terrain. Caracas teaches that terrain bends strategy. This is why the third strategic position, the fortress city of Caracas, is decisive. You cannot conquer a city you cannot enter. You cannot enter a city you cannot map. You cannot map a city you cannot survive. You cannot survive a city that exists in vertical layers you do not control. Caracas is the final insurmountable barrier. You cannot take Venezuela without taking Caracas. You cannot take Caracas without taking Ávila. You cannot take Ávila without the tunnels. You cannot take the tunnels if the defender destroys them. Therefore, you cannot defeat Venezuela militarily. The campaign dies here. The doctrine dies here. The illusion dies here. And the truth no one in Washington wants to say aloud stands unmovable. Caracas is the great